When a government runs completely out of money, they don't exactly just get, like, a polite decline notice on a corporate credit card.
No, no, they don't.
Yeah.
It's a lot messier than that.
Right. I mean, imagine the sheer panic of a government having to physically pack its actual tangible gold reserves onto a cargo airplane.
Literally loading up the planes.
Yeah, flying that gold to another country and handing it over to a foreign treasury just to, keep the lights on at home.
It is the absolute ultimate economic nightmare. And it's not a hypothetical scenario at all. It is exactly what happened to India in 1991.
Which is, frankly, a perfect, if slightly terrifying place to start. Because today, whether you're maybe cramming for a macroeconomics meeting or trying to decode the financial news, or you're just insanely curious about how an entire country manages its wallet without going bankrupt.
Which is a huge task, obviously.
Totally. Well, this deep dive is for you. We're unpacking a really remarkably detailed economics lecture from UPSC Chronicles. It's a comprehensive look at India's Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, or as it's known, the FRBM Act.
Which I will admit sounds like a very dry piece of legislation when you just see the name on paper.
It really does. It sounds like homework.
Yeah, but when you look closer, it's actually this super dramatic story. It's about how a government tries to legally bind its own hands, just to avoid absolute economic ruin.
Exactly. So we're going to explore how a massive country actually manages its checkbook. Like, why the temptation of a literal money printing machine is so dangerous.
And, of course, the ongoing battle between political promises and economic reality, because those two rarely line up.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack this, because to understand how a country gets to the point of flying its gold out of the country, we have to look at the environment that creates that massive debt in the first place.
The foundational problems, yeah.
Yeah. And the lecture gives a really great way to visualize this. A scenario that I think anyone listening can relate to, the household budget.
Oh, it scales up surprisingly well to a national level.
Mm-hmm.
So consider a family sitting at their kitchen table, right? Every month, their combined income is, let's say, 80,000 rupees.
Okay, 80,000.
But every single month, their essential living expenses, rent, groceries, utilities, those amount to 100,000 rupees.
So just to literally survive, they're short by 20,000 every single month.
Exactly. They have to borrow that difference. And at first, it might feel manageable. You borrow from a relative. Maybe you put it on a high-interest credit card.
We've all been there.
Right. But the math is just relentless.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, the interest on that initial 20,000 starts to compound. So suddenly you're paying interest on the interest you already owe.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need a PhD to know that family is heading straight for a cliff. But what always trips people up, and I see this on the news all the time, is how we talk about this shortfall.
The terminology can be confusing, yeah.
Oh, it is. People throw around the words deficit and debt interchangeably, like they mean the exact same thing. But they represent entirely different parts of this crisis, right?
They do, and it's a vital distinction, especially for anyone trying to, really understand government finance. If we connect this back to you, the listener, think about the difference between your monthly income and your overall net worth.
Okay.
A fiscal deficit is like that monthly negative cash flow. It is a recurring year-over-year shortfall. Every time the annual budget is short, that specific amount is your fiscal deficit for that specific year.
So the 20,000 rupees the family is short this month, that right there is the deficit.
Precisely. Debt, on the other hand, is cumulative. It's the massive accumulated mountain of all those yearly deficits stacked on top of each other, plus all the compounding interest.
Okay, so if you borrow 100 rupees this year and 100 rupees next year, your deficit each year was only 100.
Right.
But your total debt is now 200 rupees, plus whatever interest you owe.
Exactly. And here is where it gets really sobering on a national scale.
How?
Well, when a government runs these massive deficits and builds up that mountain of debt, they are engaging in intergenerational borrowing.
Oh, wow. Intergenerational.
Yeah. They're essentially putting today's infrastructure and social programs on a national credit card that tomorrow's future generations, our children, our grandchildren, will literally have to pay off through future taxes.
That is heavy, but it makes perfect sense. And it really explains the trap that post-independence India found itself in, according to the source.
Absolutely. Following British rule, the economy was heavily depleted. The newly independent government faced this crushing dual responsibility.
Right, they had to rebuild.
Yeah, they had to simultaneously drive massive industrial development while also funding critical social welfare programs for a population that was really struggling.
But because the population was largely impoverished, tax revenue was incredibly low, they just didn't have the income to match their ambitions.
They didn't. So they relied heavily on borrowing.
And as we look at the historical timeline in the lecture, this really accelerated in the 1980s. The government adopted what economists call an expansionary policy.
Which essentially means aggressively pumping money into the economy to force growth. They were spending far, far beyond their means, and this leads to a dangerous side effect called crowding out.
Okay, I want to make sure we really grasp this. Crowding out. If the government is borrowing heavily from the domestic market, they're basically going to the banks and soaking up all the available lending capital. Right.
That's exactly the mechanism, yeah.
Because the government is considered a safe borrower.
Right, banks prefer to lend to them. The government outbids the private sector. So a private business owner who maybe needs a loan to build a factory or hire workers.
They suddenly find that interest rates are too high.
Yes, or the capital simply isn't there anymore. So private investment declines.
Wow. So the government might be building a new highway, but because private businesses can't get loans to grow, those businesses aren't generating new wealth or paying the new taxes the government desperately needs to actually pay off the highway.
It's a vicious cycle.
It really is. But this leads to a question that I think anyone listening might be like shouting at their speakers right now.
What's that?
If the government is the ultimate authority and they are short on cash, why didn't they just ask the central bank to print more money?
Well, the astonishing reality is that is exactly what they did.
Wait, really? It sounds like a cheat code in a video game that shouldn't exist in real life.
I know, but it was a very real automatic mechanism. It was called deficit monetization.
Deficit monetization.
Yeah. Throughout the 1980s, whenever the government's budget showed a deficit, the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, would automatically monetize that shortfall.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning the RBI would literally print new currency to cover the gap and hand it over to the government to spend.
A literal money printing machine to cover the bills. But, I mean, we know that doesn't work long term. Let's break down the why. What is the actual consequence of printing your way out of debt?
This brings us to the fundamental mechanics of inflation. Money is really just a representation of value, right?
Right.
If the RBI prints new money and pumps it into the economy, but the actual productivity of the country, like the physical amount of goods and services being created, hasn't increased, you disrupt the balance completely.
Oh, I see. It's the classic supply and demand problem.
Exactly.
So if an economy only produces 10 apples and suddenly everyone has twice as much cash in their pockets because the government printed it, there are still only 10 apples. The seller is just going to double the price of the apples.
That is exactly what happens, and general prices soar. So because of this automatic financing mechanism, India was trapped in a cycle of persistent, incredibly painful inflation.
And all of this, the reckless borrowing, the crowding out of private enterprise, the unchecked money printing, it all culminated in that catastrophic breaking point we mentioned earlier, right? The 1991 balance of payments crisis.
Yes, that was the boiling point.
Let's ground that term balance of payments because it sounds, highly technical, but
Right.
It essentially means the country's checking account with the rest of the world ran completely dry.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the numbers from that time are just staggering.
How bad was it?
By 1991, the fiscal deficit had hit 8.4% of GDP.
Wow.
The overall debt burden, combining both the central and state governments, was sitting at a massive 80 to 85% of GDP.
85%.
And worst of all, foreign exchange reserves dropped so low, India only had enough foreign currency to pay for just 2 weeks' worth of vital imports, like oil.
Oh my God, they were 2 weeks away from being shut out of the global economy.
Yes,
Right.
which forced that deeply humiliating moment where the actual physical gold reserves had to be mortgaged to the UK just to secure emergency funding.
I can't even imagine the political fallout from that.
It was the ultimate wake-up call, and it forced massive economic reforms. In 1991, liberalization, privatization, opening up to global trade, all of that.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting in the lecture, they survived the 1991 crisis. The economy started to grow again, but the underlying behavioral habits, the political addiction to borrowing, that didn't actually change, did it?
No, it didn't. Throughout the 1990s, the fiscal deficit kept hovering in that dangerous 7 to 8% range.
Why? I mean, didn't they learn their lesson?
Because policymakers realized a harsh structural truth about governance. You cannot simply rely on the quote-unquote prudence of politicians.
Ah, right. Because politicians operate on election cycles.
Exactly. They have an inherent structural incentive to spend money today to please voters, leaving the bill for the next administration.
You can't just hope they'll do the right thing when the national credit card is sitting right there on the desk. You need to take the card away.
Precisely. Economists recognized that fiscal management could not be left to discretionary political choices. They needed a strict, rule-based order.
A legal framework.
Yes, a law that would dictate fiscal policy and mechanically force discipline, regardless of who is actually in power.
And that brings us to the absolute centerpiece of the lecture, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, the FRBM Act.
Introduced in 2000 and finally implemented in 2004.
Right. And, I like to think of this act like deleting the food delivery apps off your phone.
Okay, I love that. How does that translate?
Well, if you leave the apps on your phone, you have to rely on your own willpower every single night not to order an expensive, unhealthy meal, right?
And eventually you will fail.
Exactly. But if you delete the app, you legally, mechanically force yourself to walk into the kitchen and cook the groceries you already bought. The FRBM Act was the government deleting the app. It was a mechanism for forced fiscal discipline and fiscal consolidation.
We should definitely define those two terms, because they form the backbone of the entire legislation.
Yeah, let's do that.
So fiscal consolidation is the process of improving the overall financial health of the state. It means doing things like improving tax collection mechanisms to increase revenue and actively decreasing wasteful expenditure. So the actual need to borrow shrinks.
Okay, and fiscal discipline?
Fiscal discipline is the legal commitment to actually stay within those consolidated boundaries, actually following the rules you set.
So how did the FRBM Act force this diet? Like, what were the actual rules in the law?
The original act set hard, quantitative targets. Beginning in 2004, the government was legally bound to reduce its revenue deficit by 0.5% every single year.
With the goal of hitting what?
The goal was hitting absolute zero by 2008-09. And simultaneously, it had to reduce its fiscal deficit by 0.3% every year, keeping it under 3% of GDP.
Okay, wait, let me unpack that. Because we just introduced a new term, revenue deficit. How is that different from the fiscal deficit we talked about earlier?
That is a crucial distinction. Let's go back to your household analogy. A revenue deficit is like borrowing money just to buy this week's groceries or pay the electric bill. It is borrowing for day-to-day routine consumption, stuff that generates no future financial return.
Which is obviously terrible financial management. You can't put groceries on a 30-year loan.
Exactly. The FRBM Act wanted that specific type of borrowing to hit absolute zero. Now, the fiscal deficit, that's your total borrowing.
Okay.
That includes borrowing to build a new garage or upgrade your home capital expenditure.
Right.
It's generally okay to borrow some money if you are building an asset that holds value and helps you grow. That's why the fiscal deficit target wasn't zero, it was just capped at 3% of GDP.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. Groceries shouldn't be put on a loan, but a long-term asset can be.
Exactly. And perhaps the biggest game changer of all in this act, it strictly banned the RBI from automatically printing money to fund the government.
No more deficit monetization.
None. This cannot be overstated. It was a massive structural shift. Previously, the RBI was juggling two totally contradictory mandates.
Right, they were printing money to fund the government, which causes inflation.
But their core job, monetary policy, is supposed to fight inflation.
It's like trying to drive a car with your left foot stomping on the gas and your right foot slamming the brake.
That is a great visual. The FRBM Act liberated the central bank. It officially decoupled the government's borrowing from the money supply. So the RBI could now focus exclusively on independent monetary policy.
And the act also forced a totally new level of transparency, didn't it? The government couldn't just drop a confusing spreadsheet on Parliament anymore and call it a day.
No, they were legally required to present 3 specific detailed statements alongside every single budget.
And this was designed to stop them from hiding the math.
Yes. First, you have the medium-term fiscal policy statement. This basically answers the what are the fiscal goals for the next 3 to 5 years. This forced politicians to actually plan beyond the immediate election cycle.
Got it. And the second one?
Second is the fiscal policy strategy statement. This answers the how. Like, how exactly do you plan to achieve these goals? What specific taxes are you raising, or what programs are you cutting?
Okay, so the what and the how. What's the third?
Third is the macroeconomic framework statement. This exposes the assumptions. What is the government assuming about GDP growth or global inflation that justifies their budget?
Ah, I see. So if they are predicting like 15% economic growth just to make their debt look smaller on paper, this statement exposes that overly optimistic math to the public.
Exactly. It forces them to show their work.
Okay, so they pass this law, they bind their own hands, they delete the delivery app. But a rule is really only as good as a government's ability to stick to it, right? And as we all know, life is unpredictable.
It is incredibly unpredictable. And the timing for India was particularly brutal. Just as those original 2008-09 deadlines to hit the targets approached, the 2008 global financial crisis hit.
Oh, right. The entire world economy basically melted down.
Yeah. And it wasn't just a global shock. Domestically, India implemented the Sixth Pay Commission, which massively increased the salaries of government employees.
Plus, as the 2009 elections approached, there were massive loan waivers for farmers and increased subsidies, right?
Yes, all of which falls under revenue expenditure, that grocery money spending that drains resources without creating future assets. So, faced with a global crisis and immense domestic political pressure, the government simply couldn't meet the targets.
So what did they do?
The FRBM targets were officially suspended.
Okay, I have to push back here.
Go ahead.
If a government can just ignore or suspend or rewrite the rules of a law whenever things get politically or economically tough, what is the point of having the law in the first place? Doesn't it just become a joke?
That is exactly the cynical, though entirely valid critique that many economists raised at the time. The numerical targets were repeatedly missed, paused, and revised for years.
It just feels like deleting the app and then just re-downloading it when you're hungry.
Yeah, but to address this, in 2016, a review committee was formed. It was chaired by N.K. Singh, and they realized that maybe the rules themselves needed to evolve.
Right, if I'm N.K. Singh looking at this, I'm thinking, clearly the rigid 3% deficit rule isn't working in reality. Maybe we're measuring the wrong thing.
And that was exactly their conclusion. The N.K. Singh committee recommended a highly pragmatic shift. They argued that obsessing over bringing the yearly revenue deficit to absolute zero just wasn't practical for a developing nation that still genuinely needs to spend heavily on social welfare.
So what should they focus on instead?
Instead, the primary overriding goal should be managing the total overall debt.
Going back to our analogy, stop panicking exclusively about this month's credit card bill and start managing the entire 30-year mortgage.
Precisely. The committee suggested the primary objective should be bringing the total outstanding debt, which was sitting at about 70% of GDP at the time, down to a safer 60% of GDP by the year 2022-23.
And the yearly deficits.
The yearly fiscal deficits should just be flexible operational guideposts to help hit that ultimate debt goal.
Okay, that makes sense. They also formalize something else that I find incredibly fascinating in this source, the escape clause.
Ah, yes.
The pressure valve.
Right, because the committee realized you need a pressure valve in the legislation. Because if a literal meteor hits the country, you can't have the government paralyzed by a 3% deficit limit. They need to be able to act.
Exactly. So the 2018 amendment to the Act introduced this escape clause. It allowed the government to legally deviate from their fiscal targets by 0.5%.
But it wasn't just a free pass, right?
No. And this is critical. It was not a blank check. It could only be triggered for specific abnormal situations that were explicitly prescribed in the law. Things like an act of war, severe agricultural failure, or a pandemic.
Which brings us crashing right into the modern day. Because the ultimate test of the FRBM Act and that newly minted escape clause arrived in 2020 with COVID-19. The pandemic brought the global economy to a devastating halt. Tax revenues vanished practically overnight because economic activity just stopped.
Meanwhile, the government had to spend astronomically on emergency health care, massive stimulus packages, survival welfare.
Exactly. So the escape clause was absolutely triggered, and the targets were entirely blown out of the water once again.
So if we look at the reality today, as we head into the 2025-26 targets mentioned in the lecture, the fiscal deficit is hovering around 4.5%, which is well above that original 3% dream.
Yeah.
And total debt. It is right back up to that terrifying 80 to 85% of GDP level we saw just before the 1991 crisis.
The raw numbers certainly paint a discouraging picture on paper, yes.
So I have to ask you point blank. With debt back at 85% and the targets essentially constantly missed or rewritten for 2 straight decades, do we have to just call the FRBM Act a massive failure?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer is a vehement no. And the lecture in the source explicitly argues we cannot consider it a failure.
But how can it not be a failure if the debt numbers are exactly the same as they were 30 years ago?
Because the numbers alone don't tell the story of the underlying structural shift. Despite missing the specific numerical targets, the FRBM Act fundamentally, permanently changed the culture of Indian economics.
The culture.
Yes, it introduced a baseline expectation of fiscal discipline that simply did not exist prior to 2003.
I guess it forced them to at least try to cook at home and acknowledge the budget, even if they occasionally downloaded the delivery app again during emergencies.
That's a very fair way to look at it.
Yeah.
But more tangibly, it permanently ended deficit monetization. The RBI has never gone back to being the government's personal printing press.
Right, which drastically improved inflation control for the average citizen.
Exactly. It also forced immense transparency. The government can never again just hide its budget assumptions. And globally, by having a legally binding framework on the books, it significantly boosted India's creditworthiness to international investors, which lowers the cost of borrowing for everyone.
Okay, so it's not a failure, but it clearly needs a lot of work. I mean, debt is still at 85%. So what is the way forward? Since we are doing a deep dive, let's look at the actionable solutions the source provides for the future, because they are incredibly pragmatic.
They are. The lecture outlines several clear steps. First is the adoption of a countercyclical fiscal policy.
Meaning going against the natural economic cycle.
Exactly. The concept is simple, but hard to do. When the economy is booming and tax revenues are high, the government shouldn't just spend that surplus. They need to aggressively save it.
So that when a recession inevitably hits, they have a massive war chest to stimulate the economy without blowing up the debt.
Right.
But politically, how do you actually do that? Imagine a politician standing at a podium and saying, hey, the economy is booming, times are great, so I am not going to build that new hospital. I'm going to put the money in a savings account. That is the ultimate political friction.
It is incredibly difficult to execute, which is exactly why it requires immense political will. Now, the second solution tackles a similar friction, rationalizing subsidies.
Notice it doesn't say eliminate subsidies.
Right, because in a developing nation, welfare is absolutely required. But rationalize means targeting those subsidies effectively to the people who truly need them,
Yeah.
and ruthlessly cutting purely wasteful, politically motivated spending. What the source calls election-time freebies designed just to buy votes.
Which flows perfectly into the third solution, shifting the nature of government spending entirely, moving away from revenue expenditure and heavily toward capital and social infrastructure.
Yes. This is the difference between paying for a farmer's fertilizer today versus building a highly efficient freight railway that lasts 50 years. Investing in capital infrastructure like highways, digital grids, public health, that actually generates the future economic growth and tax revenue required to pay off the debt.
The fourth solution involves a critical dynamic. Center-state coordination. The source notes a crazy statistic, actually.
Yeah.
22% of all central tax revenue goes directly down to the individual states.
Which means the central government cannot achieve fiscal consolidation on its own isolated island.
Right. If the center saves money but the states wildly overspend, the national debt still grows.
Exactly. The center has to actively consult the states and financially incentivize them to use their 22% share for that capital infrastructure we just talked about, rather than just routine spending.
Fifth is a fascinating recommendation that still hasn't happened. Establish an independent fiscal council.
This was a major N.K. Singh committee recommendation. They envisioned an independent body entirely free from government intervention. Think of it as an objective referee on the field.
Okay. What would they do?
Their job would be to monitor compliance, assess economic risks, and loudly call out if the government's budget assumptions are actually credible or if it's just overly optimistic math again.
We need more referees. And finally, the sixth solution, leveraging technology. Using real-time digital tracking of public expenditures and aggressively digitizing the tax administration to bring more people into the tax net, which stops leakages in the system.
It's all about efficiency at that point.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've explored a lot of macroeconomic history today, but the core takeaway is that government borrowing is not just abstract math happening in a vacuum. It is deeply, intensely personal.
It really is.
A government's fiscal deficit dictates the inflation rate, which decides the actual purchasing power of the currency sitting in your pocket right now. And that accumulated debt, that is quite literally the tax burden that your children and grandchildren will carry.
It is the ultimate balancing act of managing the urgent needs of the present without completely stealing from the future.
Exactly. And this raises an important question, something for you to mull over after this deep dive ends. It builds on that concept of the escape clause.
The 0.5% deviation for emergencies.
Right. When the FRBM Act was written, things like a global pandemic or a massive supply chain breakdown were considered rare, once-in-a-generation anomalies. But look at the modern world.
It's chaotic.
We are arguably entering an era of constant overlapping crises, what economists call a polycrisis. We are seeing rolling health emergencies, accelerating climate change disasters, and constant geopolitical shocks.
It makes you wonder, if these abnormal situations are happening every 3 or 4 years, will the escape clause simply become the new normal?
Yeah. And if governments are permanently forced to operate in emergency mode, do the old, rigid rules of fiscal responsibility need to be completely torn up and rewritten for a fundamentally more volatile world?
It's a slightly terrifying but entirely necessary thought, because it turns out that magic, bottomless government wallet doesn't actually exist.
And pretending it does just leaves the family at the kitchen table with a mountain of debt they can never repay. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll see you next time.